So at that Iconis, this whole question of idea has been, a kind of a never-ending one at SEDNet. It's been baked into who we are since our founding, and one that we haven't answered by any stretch. I've been with SEDNet about 7.5 years or so I'm a baby compared to some of you, and probably an old lady compared to some of you. So at Iconis that year, at our last panel of the event, there was this great moment that if any of you who were there will hopefully remember, and if you weren't there, I'll try to tell the story well. My very dear friend, Nadia Kidwai, was on that panel, and she was up on a stage like this, and it was her and Mike Lewis. Is Mike here? He's not here. He's not here. So a lot of you know Mike. He's been around SEDNet and this work for a very long time. And then next to him was a woman, Marie-Cécile Nodaway, an Indigenous social entrepreneur. And Nadia and Marie-Cécile, Nadia is a Pakistani woman who grew up in Wales and then ended up in Canada. She is Muslim, she wears the hijab, and Marie-Cécile is an Indigenous entrepreneur. And they made a little joke beforehand that it was like an ice cream sandwich with Mike Lewis between them. So if you know them, you can imagine there was two people of color, and then Mike Lewis, who's an older white man in the middle. And Nadia has taught me a lot about how to talk about this stuff because she is so frank and open and hilarious. She worked with us for a while. She's now at CBC Radio in Winnipeg on Saturday mornings. And she always says, be frank, let's talk about it. And so she made the joke on the stage. I'm sure it made a few people go, oh, what did she say? Because we had asked the panelists that day to reflect on the conference, on what they were hoping they would see going forward in our movement. And she said, well, I hope that in a couple of years I see a lot more ice cream sandwiches in the room. And so I tell that story because she talks like that constantly. You can't get away from these conversations with Nadia. She makes it easier to talk about this stuff. She challenges me constantly, but in a way that makes me laugh and makes me want to talk about it more. So I'm doing that really purposefully because these events, I do events all the time. This is probably like conference number 600 or something for me. I also organize a music festival and a lot of community events in Winnipeg, and I've come to really believe that events like this are not just networking opportunities and they're not just learning opportunities, they're actually a little microcosm of the world that we live in. Events like this are an opportunity for us to practice organizing the world the way we think it ought to be organized all the time. And so when we do this, and by doing this, the very first thing that's going to set the tone for the whole conference, it's one of those actions where we're making a choice to model what we think the world ought to be like. And for us, in this movement, we think the world ought to have frank, open conversations about why some people aren't included, or why there's not equity, or why diversity doesn't happen the way that we wish it would. So I wanted to set that tone for you, that it doesn't have to be heavy, although sometimes it is. It can be frank and be funny. It can be warm and open and challenging all at the same time. And it's a tone that we want to see happen through the whole event. And so we're going to do that. I'm going to let Nadia's voice ring out in my head and kick us in the pants to actually take this seriously. And I'm going to invite an incredible panel of folks who've also been thinking about this kind of thing through their whole careers to come and join me. And then I'm going to start asking questions and shut up so that other people can speak a little bit. So why don't you come join me, panelists, on the stage in whatever order you will, and I'll introduce them as they're coming up. So we've got, see what order they're coming in, Carol Ann Hilton. So Carol Ann sits on our board at SEDNet, which is a great gift to us, bringing her wisdom, and she's the founder of the Indigenomics Institute. As we were saying at the table, I think she's the person I know who travels the most of anybody I've ever met. It's remarkable. Working with communities all across Canada and even internationally. And sitting next to her is Joanna Reynolds, the Director of Social Enterprise at the Center for Social Innovation. I got that right? Yep, and has done many, many other things, worked in the community in lots of different ways, in social finance and social innovation and in community work. And on the far left, or my left, your right, is Robert Lessard, How was I don't have a very good French accent. It was good? Okay, good. Director of Operations with Recycle Action, which is part of Group Convex in Ontario. Many of you will be familiar. They're a great organization with a bunch of enterprises working to create jobs for people that have a hard time getting employment. And there's two missing, mysterious members of the panel that you can't see right now. They're real people, but they're not here. So we started talking about this a couple months ago and had two others that were going to join us who, for various personal reasons, ended up having to cancel last minute. And I wanted to make sure you knew that they were a part of the conversation because everything that flows from here was really directed by how we all talked about this work. So the other two folks were Natasha Jackson. Natasha right now is the Director of Communities Nova Scotia, has also been a SEDNet member over her career and done lots of really interesting work from both the community level and a government level, has really thought about this inclusion stuff, particularly working with African Nova Scotians. And then Bill Nynex. If you know Bill, he's a wonderful gentleman. He's been a part of SEDNet for a long time. He's involved with Leclerc Co-op in Victoriaville, Quebec. We invited Bill both for his long history in co-ops and community economic development, but also because he is a person who lives with disabilities and is thoughtful and articulate about what that's like as a personal experience and how his organization has adapted to include him well. And then he reminded us that he's also a senior, and seniors are often voices that are not well included as well. So he, right off the hop in our conversation, kicked me in the pants. So get a lot of kicking in the pants when you start talking about diversity seriously. So that's our panel. So imagine you can feel the presence and influence of those two mystery folks that helped direct this but aren't here today. So thank you so much for being here. To get things kind of started, I think we could just go one at a time and introduce yourselves a bit more. I gave the highest level introduction possible and just talk a bit about sort of what you're bringing to this work. Yeah, well, we can go this direction, I think. So Caroline, why don't you kick it off?
Uklasish Caroline Hilton, Heshgak Supsish Uklas, Wakatush Koatsa Umti. I am Caroline Hilton. I am New Channel from the completely other side of the country. I think I'm from the Heshquiat Nation near Tofino on Vancouver Island. And my New Channel name is Wakatush, which means big sister. I come from a line of the oldest woman, and that's a name that I carry that tells me who I am across time in terms of my family and Indigenous reality of where I'm from that marks me both in time and in space. And in acknowledging and thanking the host here for inviting me to come spend this time with you. Also acknowledging the Elsipagtog, I said it with a really thick New Channel accent, the territory that we do business on and work and create relationships here over the next couple days. So I am the CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute, and the Institute is economics from an Indigenous worldview. I'm coming for the heart of neoclassical economics. It's a warning. And that's what keeps me busy, and that's really what interests me is strengthening Indigenous economies. And part of my role is being called into leadership. I've just finished 2 years on the Canadian Economic Growth Council. I sit on the BC Emerging Economy Task Force, the BC Indigenous Investment Business Council, so a lot of advisory work around strengthening Indigenous economy. I work all across the nation in terms of building First Nations economic development corporations, and in my work I'm facilitating the question, how do we collectively create a $100 billion Canadian Indigenous economy?
Mike. She just dropped the mic, and she should. Because I can't even imagine what $100 billion is at all. So that's a pretty cool goal.
That's a good goal. Good goal. Well, thank you. And I'm thrilled to be on the stage with each of you. Thanks. And thanks, Sarah, for sharing a little bit about, who you are and where work placed. I appreciate that. it made me think a little bit more about how I was going to introduce myself. So I'm Joanna Reynolds. Most folks call me Jo, so you're welcome to do that as well. And I have my roots in community work. I started in Toronto, West Neighborhood House many years ago, mostly doing community organizing. And then actually, in 2006, I went to a SEDNet event in Vancouver, and it honestly changed my life. It was a huge turning point for me attending that conference, because I saw people coming together to make change happen in a way that I had never seen possible, where we actually work on the economic level and the social level and the environmental level. And I knew after that moment, I just went by myself. I didn't know anybody. I just knew I felt for some reason I wanted to be there, and flew across the country to go. And I felt like, yeah, this is where I want to commit my time and my life to. And a huge part of that is the big idea. And I think our idea that we want to talk about over this panel is the biggest opportunity for us in Canada, and across our all of our places where we live. And I am coming from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples, which is very large territories, and in that is Kingston, Ontario. It's a very small place, but that's where I'm living now with my family. I'm a queer woman, and I'm married. I have two little kids, and I actually have been homeless. I've never said that out loud, but I have been for 2 years in a tumultuous period of my life. And it was around my coming out period of time where, that was a big moment. And I have a learning disability. I'm dyslexic. Another thing I never ever say out loud, but you know what? It made me think when you were reflecting that as we talk about idea, it's helpful sometimes for us to identify in ourselves where the areas of privilege we come from. I have skin privilege. I have economic privilege and education privilege. I have a lot of it, and I walk through my life with ease in that way. So there's all kinds of areas for me to see and recognize that privilege, and there's areas in my life where I still am confronted with bias, oppression, sometimes fear, as I raise my children in this society, as we all do. And I think we all have that wherever we reside. And I think the exciting thing about this conversation for me today is that we're talking about the economy. And the economy is what has structured so much of our oppressive systemic systems. Like, it is so deeply entrenched in hundreds and hundreds of years of culture and mindsets, of policy and of markets, that as a group of people amongst many more who are seeking to really revolutionize and change that, that's an exciting place for the opportunity that IDEA gives us to reside. So see where these conversations go. Thank you.
I might just say thank you so much for being honest about those things. That's incredible. Yeah, thanks. Robert, go.
Alors, bonsoir. Je suis le français du groupe, donc la raison que vous avez des appareils, c'est de ma faute. Ou création d'emploi, un des deux. Je suis, contrairement à Sarah, c'est ma première fois que j'adresse un groupe. Donc, j'espère que ça ne paraîtra pas trop. Sarah, ça fait 6 ans, mais moi, c'est ma première. Donc, mon nom est Robert Lessard. Je suis de Hawkesbury, en Ontario. Donc, presque voisin avec madame, qui vient de Kingston, d'où on est dans ce qu'on appelle le Forest, et puis pratiquement sur les lignes du Québec. Je fais partie du groupe Convex. C'est un réseau d'entreprises sociales qui existe depuis bientôt 15 ans. L'année prochaine, on va célébrer notre 15e anniversaire. Je suis le père de 3 petites filles, donc un homme comblé, 4 femmes chez nous. Donc, puis tout cas, je m'en sauve quand même pas si mal. Ça fait, comme je dis, ça fait 12 ans que je suis avec le groupe Convexe. Et puis, on travaille beaucoup du côté des réseaux d'entreprises sociales. Mais dernièrement, il va y avoir un changement. Il y a des gros changements qui vont être annoncés l'année prochaine, justement à cause du côté inclusif avec les emplois. Groupe Convexe, sa mission, c'est de créer de l'emploi valorisant pour des gens qui autrement n'auraient pas de possibilité d'emploi ou de garder leurs emplois. La situation économique dans la région d'Hawkesbury est très difficile pour des gens de tous les jours qui ont tous leurs moyens. Imaginez-vous si vous avez un handicap quelconque. Un défi qu'on a juste pour... on est dans un milieu rural comparé à ici, Kingston, Toronto, tout ça. Donc, le défi qu'on a, nous, chez nous, c'est des défis de transport. Donc, dans Prescott-Russell, on a 45 minutes d'une entreprise à l'autre. On a 8 entreprises. Et puis, il y a un volume d'environ 75 000 personnes, mais il y a beaucoup de distance. Et puis, pour les gens, pour nos employés, c'est très, très difficile. Donc, l'inclusion est encore plus difficile. Et puis, c'est un défi qu'on vit à tous les jours. Fait qu'on regarde à faire beaucoup de changements de placement pour essayer d'aider puis de régler le problème.
Thank you. So to kind of move us into a bit of conversation, we're going to try to have the kind of panel where we discuss together, not just answer one at a time. But maybe I'll start with Joanna, because I think you were one of the first folks that we talked to. Mike Toy, who lots of you know, of course, who doesn't like being on stage, so he puts me up here, wherever he is. Thanks a lot. I think he talked to you first, maybe, or you were one of the first folks that he talked to. So maybe to kick it off, kind of what do you think the status of IDEA, of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access is in our work, community economic development?
The status. Okay. Well, I think we can look around the room. We have, I think there's, there's a lot of work to do, right? So where I feel like it's important to lean into is a place of possibility and abundance, and stepping into conversations and spaces. And maybe we can have these conversations a bit more now about what that looks like. But we're in a time, as we all know, where we have huge swings taking place, and they're scary. They're scary in a lot of ways, and they're opportunities for us to affect change as well. And I think when I look out across the world, I see lots of people, lots of organizations and clusters of people who are working towards creating more idea, like we'll say inclusivity, diversity, equity, and access, but we still have patterns that we continue to forge. They just continue to be recreated. And those patterns are recreated often by people like myself who have privilege in a way because we don't see we don't notice it in the ways we're talking about creating change in systems, and how do we provide more access for people into the economy, but we haven't spent enough time, I don't think, really pointing out and identifying for people like myself what are the issues in those systems that allow for our patterns to continue, because they keep happening in areas of policy, in areas of organizing. And so perhaps there's a chance for us who hold that privilege to take some ownership and responsibility and name them and talk about it a little bit more, find ways of doing that. But what holds us back, I think, and I'm just talking from my perspective here, what holds us back often is a feeling of shame and a feeling of fear. And in some ways, those things get in the way. And so if we can, we're all here under a place of shared values, of seeking equality and justice. Perhaps there's an opportunity there, and we've been invited to think in mindful ways that we can start to identify those systemic privileges that exist. So I'll name that, that's something work for us to do, perhaps.
Sure. Thanks. Maybe I'll jump to you, Caroline. Any reflections on Joanna's words or your reflections on what kind of the status is in our movement of doing this work?
I'm going to start with a story.
Awesome.
So, however many years ago, in the village of Mowatchit, which is now called Gold River, a ship came around the point into the harbor. Our people had never seen a ship before, so they went out and they brought the canoes out, and they brought canoefuls of fish to go out to meet that boat into an unknown reality of what they had never seen before. So what they were doing was creating a social economy of relationship. The people that were on that boat, we call them Mamathni, a people that live on a boat or have no home. So the word reflected the experience of that relationship. We live in a time of truth right now, a time of coming out, of bringing truth into the light. So the truth of this country is this country was built on the invisibility of Indigenous people. But what we're experiencing is the inclusion and the increased visibility of Indigenous people. The reason that I told you that story about the boat coming into the harbor and about our people bringing fish to that boat was that however many years later, the evidence of the explorers that were on that boat was entered as testimony because my Nuu-chah-nulth people took Canada to court because we had lost a right to an economy. Our reserve systems were so small that we had no access to the ocean. The regulatory and policy environment was such that we lost an entire economy. We no longer had the ability to create access to the ocean, that concept of the ocean is our garden. So the very fact that the testament of the explorers that identified that our people brought salmon to that boat, Canada to this day argued that really what was happening was that our people were very giving. It was like Christmas, and it did not translate into a modern function of an economy. We cannot live both ways. We cannot live with an Indigenous experience of the highest poverty levels and also create this concept of an economy that works for all. As long as Canada is in court fighting our people, saying we do not have a right to a modern transaction to sell fish, that is the type of colonial shenanigans that I speak of, that the requirement to be able to acknowledge the systems that have been built for exclusion, the systems that have been designed for invisibility, that is the reality and the truth that we live within today. We cannot rise and be inclusive with policy and a regulatory environment that's exclusive and designed for economic exclusivity. My people only want on the water to be able to have access to support family, to support community life. This is a time, and in the work that I do in writing Indigenomics, the Global Power Shift, by design, a seat at the economic table. Indigenous peoples today are building our seat at the economic table of this country. There's nobody within Canada, within the governments, that are saying, let's all move over and create room for Indigenous people. The leadership is coming from Indigenous people. 289 court cases today where we have won, hands down, the space for our modern reality, our modern economic reality, our right to be included, our right to be recognized, our right to continue as people. If you look at the international framework, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that includes a right to an economy. Who in this room thinks specifically of, I am facilitating the right to even be included to have an economy? The starting point is entirely different for Indigenous people. The starting point to say, my space in modern reality, my space to have a right to an economy, even that right had to be fought for, to be recognized, to be seen, to be included. So that concept and the ability, and I raise my hands to the organizers of this, to start with such an important conversation. We are in a time right now where this federal government is putting out a recognition framework. So the very concept of recognition holds within it inclusion, diversity, access. I live in a reality where I have to fight for access to resources or fight for access for ability even to continue a specific way of life. So if you look at the facilitation of that concept of idea, what is the starting point in the ability to speak from privilege of the systems, rules, and design that allows the ability to create local economy? I speak infrequently of a report, Inclusion Works. It's a national organization, and they did a 2017 national survey. And what their survey results said was out of 85% of Canadian small businesses, those 85% did not include, acknowledge Indigenous peoples in any way, shape, or form. That is the space that we're talking about. So 85% of Canadian small businesses in general do not acknowledge, engage, or work with First Nations and local people. So that ability to bring recognition, to bring visibility, and to practice inclusion, that is the space and the truth that we're speaking of today. Thank you.
How many mic drops are allowed for a person in one panel? Lots of mic drops. If I had to summarize between the two of you, the status of our work then is complicated. And when we start to decolonize as a privileged person, as a settler in Canada, then it gets even further complicated. And we need to bear that in mind, that the starting point isn't the same for everybody. And the starting point that we need to start at is a hard one. Thank you. And thank you for including story. I really appreciate that a lot. I think we learn that way. So thinking about that and thinking about our movement, we're doing community economic development, we're in social innovation, some of us are building social enterprises, building community-based organizations. That's a lot of your work, Robert. What do you think about that work points us in the right direction? And where do we maybe fall short when we do this work to try to create a different economy?
Premièrement, j'ai pas la parole facile comme vous avez. Je suis un directeur d'opération dans des entreprises sociales. Oui, on participe avec le mot idée. Dans notre communauté, dans notre ville, Hawkesbury a 10 000 de population. On participe à des rencontres et tout ça. On a décidé, nous, il y a une des phrases qui disait « How do we change our patterns? » J'aime bien parce que ce qu'on fait chez Convex, on a changé un peu les choses, puis on a impliqué nos employés. Le mot inclusion, puis tout ça. Donc, on a créé un comité de travailleurs. Et puis, c'est un peu comme ça qu'on voit pour essayer de faire du changement dans notre communauté en les impliquant. Donc, on a 8 entreprises sociales. Il y a un comité qui est formé. Il y a un employé de chaque entreprise qui fait partie du comité. Fait qu'un, c'est très valorisant. Et puis, ils ont des rencontres à tous les 3 mois, qui est avant notre rencontre de gérant qui précède, qui suit la semaine après. Donc, ce qui arrive, c'est qu'avec ces employés-là, il y a une rencontre, il y a un dîner. Les gens nous disent ce qui va bien, ce qui ne va pas bien, ce qu'ils aimeraient avoir dans leur communauté, les problèmes qui existent, comme le transport qui sort à tous les fois. On parle des salaires, on parle d'un peu de tout. Les gérants ne sont pas là. Donc, les employés parlent avec la directrice, puis sont plus à l'aise à parler, puis ça nous aide à faire les changements nécessaires pour aider les gens qu'on veut aider de la bonne façon. Que ce soit avec des sondages, des discussions, puis tout ça. Les sujets qui sont apportés là sont apportés à la rencontre de gérants, qui est tout le temps la semaine après. Puis on discute, puis s'il y a des changements à faire, on peut même impliquer avec la municipalité. On parle beaucoup avec nos élus. Et puis, c'est un peu de cette façon-là qu'on procède à aider puis à apporter du changement, puis d'inclure nos employés aussi dans les discussions.
Thanks. I think that shifts us in the right direction. We kind of worked out a pattern or a structure here to start by wanting to really recognize that we are in a complicated place in Canada. I think our work lends us to some values that are useful in this work, but we're still all in this sort of, like some of us are doing it really well, some of us aren't, we're figuring it out. It's this really big conversation at the same time as it's a practice conversation, kind of at the very same moment. We need to be thinking, how do we change some practice in our organizations, and how do we learn about this really big, interesting, hard framework that's a part of who we are as Canadians. So kind of moving into that, like how do we start to see real change towards this? How do we start to do that? Maybe I'll toss it to Joanna again. How do we give space to difference, do you think?
Really big question that I think everyone here should have a top chance to answer. But, you know, maybe it's not so complicated. Like maybe if we just try and go, like it is complicated for sure. You can take it in lots of directions, but maybe we should bring it down to something that we can actually hold on to. You know, we've been like you just invited us to understand more about Indigenous communities and how it relates to our economies and our business. Like, just maybe we can. I remember being with, you know, we can invite ourselves, to do one thing. Like maybe it is to forge a relationship, or to understand and connect with someone from a community that we haven't worked with before, or find new ways of just relating to one another, because it really comes down to relationships in many ways. And to say that 85% of businesses in Canada haven't engaged with Indigenous communities in their business, well, that's a really interesting opportunity. That's pretty low-hanging fruit in a way, to be able to look for, as a community economic development, to bring that into practice. What does that actually mean? And we have so many other communities in Canada. Canada we have like the biggest opportunity. I think we have people in Canada who can probably speak every single language there is on earth, who have connections and inroads to every economy on the planet, I'm sure. And yet, we, for some reason, hold on to our power structures and don't let that flourish. So, you know, there's a huge economic, social opportunities and ways for us to engage and learn from our Indigenous knowledge sharing that we have, that we are now finally tuning to, and through a reconciliation process. So I think there's small things that we can maybe think about, ways that we personally, because it needs to come down to the personal level, as well as the advocating for policy change and advocating for where money and resources are spent. But we do need to make it real for us in our lives. So I'm not sure, for everyone that might be a little bit different. And I'm going to think about that for myself as well. But it is a personal commitment to, and Brett actually opened by inviting us to make a commitment, which I think is awesome. So we can actually make a personal commitment, just secret, like on your own. You're like, oh, I hope I can do this, because maybe I'll fail, because we all may try something and then we fail. But we can make a personal commitment to learn something and push out of our boundaries, and to recognize that we need to make both the concept of idea, whatever that means to you, but also to really understand and learn something from our Indigenous communities that we have all around us. We can make that personal commitment, but we could also make a collective commitment and state it, and then see how far we can get with that over the course of the year. So I think, you know, we have a grounding of solidarity and the values of community economic development that we can grow from. And I don't know, I'll leave it at that, but I think that's the opportunity. It's a big one. It's a really big one that we just need to lean into and embrace, because it's going to take us in a lot of great directions. We don't need to be afraid of what that means, I think.
I think this is really, as we get deeper into it, really illustrating what I mean by this is complicated or complex. We talked a bit about, this could go in so many different directions, and it is, and I think it has to, because just even in those last few answers, we touched on the fact that it's a personal commitment and a personal learning journey to learn more about what this means in our communities and in our lives, that it's an organizational level, that we can make decisions about how we make decisions, about how we include the voices of our most affected, of our workers, of everybody, and how we work at that organizational level. It's also at that broad policy and government level, how the federal government decides to work out that recognition framework is going to be really important for whether we make real steps forward or not. And then I think there's that bigger, less tangible thing, and you brought this up as a question when we were figuring this out, is how worldview is really shaping this. And I think that comes out of your story as well, that the more that we do that personal work, the one that seems like the smallest piece, the more we start to learn about how worldview affects us, because we tell stories then. And for me, being an Anglophone who only speaks one language, I don't know how much language shapes our lives. And I hear that in your story, that not understanding the language immediately causes me to not understand the whole thing. So when we start to work at all those levels, we get at a more interesting practice, I think, of this idea thing. I also want to check in with my panelists. I'm kind of just, we're following the questions, but not exactly as they are on the sheet. If there's anything you really want to speak to that I don't catch, make sure you do that. Did you want to speak to some? Yeah?
Okay.
I saw you looking. Okay.
A recent number that I came across around federal transfer to First Nations communities across Canada was that out of the entire pie, 98% of funding was socially based. So social development, health, education, which leaves you wonder what the other 2% was, which is where we find economic development. So that's that perfect inequality in the equation of a reality that plays out within Canada, that that the economic cart is pulling the social horse? Is that what's happening here? The equation doesn't add up. So we're looking at a country that with high social implications and very little balance within the economic reality. What I do through the Indigenomics Institute is to be able to facilitate a shift in social meaning. The new reality that we're living in that plays out daily in the Canadian media narrative is that Indigenous peoples are economic powerhouses. That's a new reality that we need to be able to get used to. The regulatory, the policy environment has not caught up with that. You look at the daily feed, the Indigenous reality, that speaks to this new formation of a message that the shift in social meaning, we are lagging behind in social meaning and have built the conscious message that Indigenous peoples are a burden on the fiscal system. But now what you see is the shift is that to create new social meaning, Indigenous peoples are economic powerhouses. And you can say you heard it here first. I believe there's an Atlantic Region report that references Indigenous economic activity impact, and just in the eastern provinces alone of 1.2 billion. I'm after a $100 billion Indigenous economy. It's possible. It requires inclusion. It requires access. It requires recognition. And it creates the ability for a focused agenda that moves us from the potential of a the cost of doing nothing, we can keep doing what we're doing, or we can look at the actual investment in a focused agenda for Indigenous economic growth, which is good for Canada and is good for community, Indigenous social and economic well-being. That design, that's Indigenomics, and that's where I build from. And the place that I build from is we as Indigenous people are powerful people, and that's the starting point to build from. Thank you.
Could I add to that as well? I just that's a great invitation. And when we look at, if we hold into a place of scarcity and fear, it keeps us so rigid. If we look at opportunities where we have had women included in our economies, where we're start to change our mindsets and spaces for more access of people with different abilities, where we have new economies that are looking at the circular economy. And that's been around for a long time, but we need to bring that in. We've lost a tremendous amount through colonialism. Like, colonialism has, and still does, has shut down, a complete shutdown of our Indigenous communities all around the world. But those of us who are settlers and have a lineage in colonialism, we've lost a lot through that too, because we have lost our connection to land as well. And our connection to diversity. It became so single-minded. There was a single pursuit that we're still living in. And our opportunity is to really shatter that. And I think for people who are seeking access to the economy, and for those of us who are working to try and change that, like, there's huge economic potential when we have inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And somehow in that, I don't think it's totally encompassing of what we're saying, that idea, that acronym, because we're missing all kinds of things people could probably say. But I'm feeling like we're missing ecology, because we do need to have a connection to our land and our world and the life that we have around us, our natural environment. But that place of abundance, rather than a place of scarcity and fear, that place of fear is what's going to hold us back from moving into the opportunity of making, and that we don't have to like that sacrifice. We sort of talked about, do we need to dismantle these movements because have we failed in terms of our achievement of what we want in diversity? Have we failed? And so therefore should we just dismantle them? That's one of the questions that we had. But I don't know the answer to that, except I think that what we can do is we can move into more a mindset of abundance and not worry about being afraid of what that might look like. But maybe we also need a playbook too, for some of us. And I think, you've given us some really useful, tangible steps that we can take, and I think there are many, many more. I just want to bring that up.
Yeah, thank you. And that's why this is the time when the organizers of Econis realize that they don't want me to be the moderator, because I got the 5-minute warning, but I really want to let everybody give some final words. We had a lot more questions because we weren't sure how easy it would be to just keep talking, and clearly it's very easy. So if it's okay, I'm going to just keep going until we are finished here. Not all our questions, but I would like every person to be able to speak. If there's any final words based on the questions we didn't answer that you really want to make sure get out there, do that. And then just the final question that we talked about, what do you hope that people will do with this as they go forward into the conference and into our time after the conference when we all go back to our work? So just your kind of like any final words you really wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to, and what are you hoping everybody will do with this as they go forward? And maybe we'll start with Robert.
Une des choses qu'on remarque, c'est qu'il y a beaucoup d'argent qui est investi dans le développement économique avec les personnes qui ont certains défis d'employabilité dans notre coin du pays. Puis, on dirait que l'argent pour aider les gens est peut-être pas distribué ou peut-être pas placé aux bonnes places. On aimerait bien qu'il y ait de l'argent qui aille à la communauté, mais aussi pour découvrir ce que les gens ont à offrir. C'est quoi leur expertise? Qu'est-ce qu'ils peuvent apporter à la communauté? Puis c'est pour ça que le mot de la fin, quand on parlait tantôt, je me disais que quand les gens arrivent à l'entreprise, au lieu de demander quels sont vos besoins, peut-être leur demander quelles sont vos forces. Puis juste ça, c'est beaucoup.
I think we all, and everyone in this room probably loves that idea, the idea of strengths-based approaches and asset-based approaches. And that starts to shift dynamics for sure. Thank you so much. Joanna.
Sort of what do I hope people might do over the course of our 3 days together? Well, get to know someone new, perhaps. Think maybe about what's a personal commitment that you might be able to make for yourself with this, from what you've heard tonight, and advocate for real change. So let's decide together where our commitment is as community economic development across Canada. Where are we going to embrace and Indigenous economies and work a lot like behind you, Carol-Ann, to get to the $100 billion or 100? Yeah, what's the goal? All right, 100 billion. Yeah, like it's possible. Right? It's possible. So, can that be a shared goal? Or what does it look like for us to have other forms of economies that we are supportive, what they might be? So maybe over the course of the 3 days, we have idea, inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, in our conversations together and solicit ideas from one another, because I think we'll generate much more when we talk about the opportunities that's in front of us. Thanks.
I love that. I'm going to pop in with one little word. That reminds me, I think for me, one really important thing is how it's hard to imagine alternative futures. And that active talking to each other and sort of imagining together that the world could be different is something that happens in these spaces. And I think it's a good thing that happens. Carol-Ann?
The ability to be aware of the significance of your voice and the significance of voices that are absent in the conversation that's happening in front of you. Your ability as leaders to be aware of the inclusivity or exclusivity of the situation that you're in requires your leadership. It requires you to be paying attention. If you look in the room that we're in right now, it was built from one worldview. And that's really what we're coming to head within humanity, is that there's alternative worldviews. That's the descending ego of this economy, that it only allows us to believe that the worldview that created it is the right one. And essentially, the ability to be inclusive, the ability to increase your leadership, this is a time for recognition, for awareness, and the ability to pay attention. And that's where the leadership will be within this room and within this country. Thank you.
Wow. Please join me in thanking our panelists. So I said at the beginning, I really truly believe that events are our opportunity to practice organizing the world as we wish it were. So take that with you. Organize your week the way that you wish the world organized itself, and that'll get us in a good direction. So I can't wait to do that with you, and I really, truly am honored to have sat up here with these folks. Thank you so much.